We humans like to think that we're history makers. We're doing things, making things, or at least participating in things. History, as it turns out, is a sad story of most of us getting really sick and dying, usually from smallpox. Welcome back to Wait a Minute in History, episode 4. We've made it to a fourth episode, which means I've surpassed Back to the Future, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, were the good ones, anyways. And we're right about the time where Land Before Time and Ice Age probably should have stopped. I would continue to stress the importance of the idea that I'm home with all you fine people right now due to a global pandemic. And that can't be overstated. Wash your hands, stay at home, and watch Wait a Minute. See, I've solved your quarantine woes for you. I'm your friendly neighborhood teacher, Mr. Hill, and today we're going to talk a little bit more about disease. Wait a minute, Mr. Hill, you say. I thought you were done talking about disease. That's fair enough. And I guess I should say, when I'm talking to all of you, I've imagined about 3 groups. Former students who want to tune in and go, oh, he's still alive. That's really cool. You've got the random phantom YouTubers who just happen to click. Hello, perfect stranger. How are you? And then a few people who I know well enough that I'm going to ask you what you thought of the video, so you've tuned in, to the channel as well. I'm going to take all of you, bundle you up into one kind of imaginary person, and name you Rufus. Okay? Today I'm going to change it up a little bit and talk a bit about how we got the idea to stop all these horrible diseases. In other words, when I tell you to wash your hands, when I tell you to keep your distance, where exactly did those kind of ideas come from? That's a good question, Rufus, and I'm going to answer that. First, let's just try to remember why we want to figure out where disease comes from and why we want to stop it. I know that's a pretty obvious answer, but this is my show, and we've reached episode 4, and I'm drunk with power, so I'm going to do whatever I want. Disease, or the history of subsequent actions around it, changes all of history. The Black Death hollowed out Europe's population and made those who survived be able to charge more for their skill, which led to more money and more free time and led to them setting aside trust funds and ruining their children. I'm kidding. But it did lead to a lot of people paying for things like art, architecture, learning, and was one of the factors which contributed to an explosion of culture and learning, which we now refer to as the European Renaissance. If you need another example, which you don't, but I'm going to give you one anyways, then you could ask the million armed Native Americans who met the European migration and invasion of the Americas and successfully repelled it. And you can't do that because that didn't happen, because smallpox and a host of other European diseases wiped out an estimated 90% of the population, an event we refer to as the Great Dying. This Great Dying allowed the European continent, on the verge of overpopulation again, to have a brand spanking new continent to move into, and due to the lack of Native Americans, greatly increased what Jefferson referred to as the peculiar institution, which we hope is the 18th century version of horrible and awful specter of African slavery. Disease changes history. And people living close together allowed disease to spread pretty darn quickly. Say what you will about hunter-gatherers, you can't kill off a whole city if they ain't no city to kill off. Again, one of the things you can look into history to see the minimizing of this whole everyone gets sick and dies thing would be the development of inoculation, which started with smallpox in the early 18th century, effectively wiping it off the planet, knock on wood. And the development of antibiotics and antivirals in the 20th century, again, knock on wood. But when did we start investigating, like really investigating disease and where it came from and just maybe how to stop it? Well, other civilizations, such as China, have had certain tracking and limiting systems for thousands of years, partially as a result of a more organized and more densely populated area over a longer period of time. But as far as the beginnings of modern epidemiology, which is dealing with the incidence, distribution, and control of disease, we have the relatively famous example of Dr. John Snow. No, not that John Snow. You know nothing. This Dr. John Snow, physician and well-dressed bon vivant, and the London cholera epidemic of 1854. You can tell by the cutting job I'm not an elementary school teacher. Dr. Snow is credited with, among other things, discovering that cholera is a waterborne bacteria, which was a big deal. Because while quite a few medical professionals were beginning to come around to the ideas of infection and prevention, the idea of miasma, or foul smell, making you sick was relatively prominent among the populace of London at the time. And believe me when I tell you that the Soho area of London, which was hardest hit by the cholera epidemic, which is relatively hot-toned and fancy to do now, had plenty of terrible smells in 1854. The area was filled with cramped apartments, which we call tenements, and was the home of all kinds of fun old school innovations. Among them was the cesspool, or cesspit, which was the answer to drainage, sewage, and pretty much all other waste products you didn't want in your house. Large pits of filth, which sat right outside of most tenement buildings and conveniently next to wells, which most of London still used for water at the time. I will allow you to start making the poor choice connection loop on that one. So what happened? Well, it began with baby Lewis at number 40 Broad Street, who was, we're pretty sure, the first reported cholera patient. So let's pause and briefly talk about cholera. Cholera enjoys a place on the top 10 killers of men list for a pretty good reason. It will kill you, and it's icky. Vibrio cholerae is a waterborne bacterium that loves the human gut and ergo human poop. If you were paying attention to my comment about cesspits and pumps a minute ago, then you can pretty much figure out where I'm about to go with this. The human gut does not feel the same way about cholera and attempts to throw it out of its house with violent and sometimes continuing bouts of diarrhea, which is super gross. For those of you who have had that unfortunate experience, and please put your hand down, I don't need to know that information ever. You'll understand that when you turbo diarrhea, you get dehydrated and you find a powerful need to drink more water, thus allowing more of that horrible, horrible bacteria into your system. So when you have large ponds of human poop literally chilling out in the sun and also finding time to seep into the pumps for drinking water that sat right next to them, you have successfully created a closed diarrhea death loop. Coincidentally, Dr. Snow had got wind of the growing issue, which was also fortuitously looking for concentrated outbreaks of illness to study. Oh, doctors, you morbid, wonderful people, you. So he and a few others went to the neighborhoods that seemed to be hardest hit and literally went down the street knocking on doors. Good day, madam or sir. Would you be able to provide me with the information on the number of people who have pooped themselves to death within this domicile? That's how I imagine it happened, you know. After doing this and compiling the data with help from a local priest, Father Henry Whitehead, a map emerged with a concentration right around the Broad Street pump and well. After seeing the concentration of cases and combining it with Father Whitehead's colloquial information that people generally liked drawing water from the Broad Street pump because it tasted sweet, the less that's said about that, the better. Dr. Snow asked for the handle on the Broad Street pump to be removed. Sure enough, the number of cases dropped and the epidemic subsided. Dr. Snow's revolutionary approach also set up the standard method by which epidemics and epidemiological spread are judged and proven today as well. Data that's so straightforward that it almost writes its own story is never the only feature in predicting, mitigating, or treating the spread of illness. There are always outliers, and what happens to those outliers, or people who didn't get sick and should have, and people who shouldn't have gotten sick and did, is at least as important. The cholera epidemic of 1854 had exceptions as well. Two groups of people who lived very close to the well that were not infected, and one specific group miles away from the well died of cholera. Our two mystery groups were a group of people who worked at a brewery, and then another group of people who lived at a worker's house, which was kind of like the 19th century version of those sad little microtel inns where traveling salesmen live and they have nowhere else to go. Here's the connection between the two. They both had alternate sources of water. The brewery is obvious, and the worker's house, they didn't let them out after a certain amount of time, so therefore they didn't have to rely on any particular pump. The story of our mysterious outlier is also pretty fascinating. There was an older woman and her niece, and they lived in an area called Hempstead, which was about 2 miles away from Soho and considered to be a much nicer area. Think of it like a suburb. Well, you can take the people out of the nasty, but it turns out you can't take the love of that sweet, sweet Broad Street water out of the people. It turns out this older woman was married to a shopkeeper, and his shop was in, you guessed it, Soho. So when he sold his shop, he used the money to buy his way out of Soho. In true, ironic, tragic, or just gross fashion, after drinking Broad Street well water for all of those years, she preferred the taste and had it delivered to her. This whole story to me is the most fascinating thing about these early forays into epidemiology, the human connection, and the beginnings of not only human epidemiology, but larger forays into the study of human population patterns, behavior, and responses, broadly called the social sciences. Today, the Broad Street well is long gone, and the corner it was on is now inhabited by the John Snow Pub. And if any of you out there decide to memorialize your old teacher, Mr. Hill, that is a good place to start. Thanks for watching Wait a Minute in History with Mr. Hill. If you've got something on your mind in history or education that you'd like for me to talk about, please let me know. If you subscribe to the YouTube channel, then drop a suggestion in the video comments below. If you're watching via Facebook or LinkedIn, send me a comment there. Thanks, and I'll see you all next time.